I'm Daniel Shore. By the summer of 1974, the House was working seriously on articles of impeachment against President Nixon stemming from Watergate. Congress is left by the Constitution to determine for itself what are the high crimes and misdemeanors for which a president can be impeached, that is, accused by the House and tried by the Senate. The cry of impeachment had gone up from the streets the previous October after the Saturday Night Massacre firing of the special prosecutor. The Watergate crisis was closing in on Richard Nixon. The public mood turned against him when he tried to kill off the Watergate investigation and fire the special prosecutor in charge of the case. Now he was being threatened with impeachment. For the first time in 100 years, a serious demand to oust the president from office hit Congress.
When I got to my office in Washington, the flood of mail that was in there, telegrams and telephone calls, was impossible to be able to count. And the question was, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And impeach, impeach, impeach.
It wasn't going to be easy. Peter Rodino, a little-known congressman, chaired the committee that had to take on the president, and Nixon could still count on a lot of support in Congress.
I would like to add a personal word with regard to an issue that has been of great concern to all Americans over the past year. I refer, of course, to the investigations of the so-called Watergate affair. I believe the time has come to bring that investigation and the other investigations of this matter to an end. 1 year of Watergate is enough.
This is one of the machines that Nixon had installed to record his office conversations. His tape recordings became the evidence that the president was party to the conspiracy to obstruct justice in the Watergate case. The courts had ordered him to hand over the first of the tapes that the Watergate special prosecutor had demanded. The president's attorney, Fred Bozart, went through them.
The lawyers started to listen to the subpoenaed tapes in preparation for turning them over, and then Brizard told me, oh my God, we've got a huge gap in one of the tapes.
The tape in question was the first recorded conversation between the president and his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, after Nixon's men broke into the Democrats' headquarters. At the exact moment they turned to Watergate, their voices were obliterated by a hum lasting 18.5 minutes. Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, said she must have erased the tape by accident while transcribing it. She had kept her foot on the tape recorder's pedal control while answering the telephone. The prosecutors asked her to reenact her story.
She started to pretend she was typing, and I said, okay, now the phone is rung. What did you do? And she supposedly hit the wrong button on the machine and reached back for the telephone. And as she reached back, her foot came off the pedal, and I was quite shocked because she wasn't reaching that far. And I must admit, I kind of lost my cool, and I, in a rather elevated voice, said, your foot has just come off the pedal. And of course the machine stopped, which meant it was not erasing. She got very flustered but said, well, it's different in my office. It didn't happen this way in my office. It's different in my office. I said to the judge, well, perhaps, Your Honor, we could adjourn to Miss Woods' office.
In her White House office, Rosemary Woods was watched by the special prosecutors and the photographer as she desperately tried to keep her foot on the pedal and her hand on the phone.
She had to reach way over way over, far beyond. I don't know if you ever saw the comic book Plastic Man, beyond anything Plastic Man could have achieved.
Even in the photograph, you can literally see she's holding on like this, and her knuckles are white as she's reaching for the phone. Now, any normal human being, of course, would have slid their chair, which was on wheels, to the phone and picked it up.
It was very hurtful. I remember Newsweek had that photograph. I don't know why we should never have allowed Newsweek into the White House. I mean, there was just one bungle after another.
Well, we had gone from the technicians in the bowels of the White House over a several-week period up to the Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig.
Ben Veniste, the prosecutor, was asking me with foam coming out of his mouth who had wiped out the 18.5 minutes, and I said, well, it may have been a sinister force. The American press, who was in the room, ran out and said, Haig claims that demons erased the tape, and I started getting letters from demonologists all over the world.
Unfortunately for the White House, the technical report was more down to earth. The gap had been caused not by a foot pedal, but by a hand.
The scientists found that someone had attempted to erase the tape. They had taken 8 separate tries at it. There were 3 people who had access to the tape and the tape recorder. One of them was Rosemary Woods, who used that tape recorder regularly, knew how to use it.
There's no one more loyal, no one more honest, no one more efficient than Rosemary Woods, and I am utterly confident that she did not erase anything.
The second was Steve Bull, a subordinate assistant to the president, who would not have taken 8 tries to erase the tape. And the third was the president himself.
Although the prosecutors never charged anyone with causing the 18.5-minute gap, the episode was damaging to Nixon. The president moved to get things under control. To take charge of the aggressive prosecution team, he appointed a new man, a conservative Texas lawyer, Leon Jaworski.
In order to have satisfied the staff, I would have had to resort to the extremest of measures that would have embarrassed, humiliated, castigated, indicted, and everything else Richard Nixon.
Jaworski made clear that what happened to the president was not for his staff to decide. Then the White House tapes were delivered to the special prosecutors.
We waited with a tape recorder in my office, listened in what was an extraordinary sort of eavesdropping into the Oval Office.
We tore off our headsets and determined that Leon Jaworski had to hear this.
He came in and said, Colonel, I think we're at a point where you're going to want to listen to something. And I said, all right. And so I stepped on where the machinery was set up.
Jaworski heard Nixon and his aides plotting how to hide evidence without risking a charge of perjury.
But you can't be good. It's very high-risk and perjury situation. I can't recall.
He was schooling him on how to keep from telling the truth, and at the same time not commit perjury, and I knew then that there was some involvement.
Leon was very pensive, and he started shaking his head, and he said, "Can you believe the President of the United States coaching a witness on how to evade the truth?"
Every lawyer, when he talks to a witness who's going before a grand jury, says, be sure that you don't volunteer anything. Be sure if you have any question about anything, say that you don't recollect.
Jaworski, an experienced criminal prosecutor, had a different interpretation of the law. He asked for an urgent appointment at the White House.
I told Haig that in my judgment the president was criminally involved, and told him that he better get the finest criminal lawyers he could find in the country.
The honeymoon between the new special prosecutor and the White House was over.
Yesterday, you shouldn't want it.
Jaworski's team was ready to proceed with a massive indictment against the key Watergate conspirators. But they couldn't agree on what to do about the final name on the list.
I see definitely a difference in the dealing with the President of the United States and the dealing with the ordinary individual.
Himself convinced that Nixon was guilty, Jaworski believed it was not his job but Congress's to bring charges against a sitting president. But his young staff was loath to surrender its case against Nixon to mere politicians. They had a powerful ally in the Watergate grand jury, 23 Washington citizens who had been hearing evidence in the case since it began.
There was not a shadow of a doubt in anybody's mind who sat there all that time, who listened, that didn't want to indict the president, because we knew that he was just as guilty as Haldeman and Ehrlichman and the rest of them. But here's a guy who's handing down all the orders.
The young prosecutors tested just how eager the jurors were.
I don't know, have mixed emotions, really.
They asked the jurors if they'd be prepared to include Nixon in the indictment.
Some of the grand jurors voted with 2 hands. Some voted with only 1, but there was no dissent.
Well, everybody raised 2 hands. Mr. Benavides broke out in a beer. He was smoking a cigar. So he spoke out in a great big grin and a laugh, and all the grand jurymen, they just turned each other and laughed, and was really a room of mirth.
But it was no laughing matter. Jaworski could no longer avoid a decision about Nixon. On February 25th, he faced the grand jurors and told them what they could and could not do.
When Mr. Jaworski came in that next day and told us that we couldn't indict a sitting president, the first question was, why not?
But Jaworski was ready to make a big concession.
Mr. Jaworski told us that there's a way that we could really indict President Nixon by gathering all the material and sending that over to the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives. And what we did, we acquiesced in that.
The grand jury's secret evidence would be passed on to the one institution that everybody agreed could act against the president, the Congress. 4 days later, the grand jury's long-awaited indictments led the news.
A federal grand jury indicts 7 former aides and campaign associates of President Nixon on charges stemming from the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover-up.
In a jammed courtroom, the foreman handed over the indictments and a suitcase of evidence. A second suitcase nearby is said to have contained evidence dealing with the president.
The briefcase full of evidence that connected the president to the Watergate cover-up was turned over to the chief counsel of the House Judiciary Committee.
We went over each item to be sure that all the items were there as had been presented to the court.
Dore at one point said to me, he said, you have to remember, and I never forgot this, he says, you just think of this as a huge jury trial, and the jury is all the people of the United States. They're all watching this, and we have to be fair, and we have to be perceived to be fair, so we sort of have to control ourselves.
We needed Republicans as well. The American people would not have accepted a vote that would have been purely a partisan vote, voting to impeach the President of the United States purely on partisan grounds.
The Constitution states that the President can be impeached only for high crimes and misdemeanors. The interpretation of this phrase was in the hands of a divided Judiciary Committee. In a closed session, the representatives began hearing witnesses. For the Democrats, John Dean's performance was crucial. He had given the most detailed account of Nixon's crimes. To counter Dean's story, the president had brought in his new criminal lawyer, James St. Clair.
St. Clair had used the entire time preparing this ingenious set of questions, contrasting different testimony in different parts of the transcript. And he proceeded to ask Mr. Dean this long, complicated question.
In the middle of his question, he was interrupted by the chairman, who said, wait a minute, the reporter's not here, we have to do that all over.
Rodino said to St. Clair, Mr. St. Clair, would you please repeat your question? And he said, I'm not sure I can, Mr. Chairman.
St. Clair couldn't remember his question. I did. So I took that opportunity to tell Mr. St. Clair and the committee, I'd be happy to answer the question. Here's the question, and here's the answer.
There were 38 trained lawyers in the room. None of us could have played it back word for word the way he did, yet all of us recognized that he was not paraphrasing, but rolling it back word for word.
This remarkable feat of memory enhanced the credibility of Nixon's chief accuser. And his testimony was corroborated by the actual tape of Dean and the president discussing how to pay hush money to the Watergate burglars.
There's no denying the fact that the White House and Ehrlichman, Hallam, and Dean are involved in some of the early money decisions. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years. You on the money, if you need the money.
I saw the tapes being played for the committee, and I watched their faces, both Democrats and Republicans. I looked from one side to the other side, and I saw them getting red and agitated, unbelieving.
Where money is, you can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten.
And I thought, oh, wonderful. It's coming across. But then, all of a sudden, my joy diminished, and I said, you'll see, they'll come back a day or two later with rationalizations, with ways of explaining things.
It's very difficult to infer that material on a given tape is detrimental to the president when all of the participants to that conversation have testified in other forums under oath and have not revealed anything detrimental to the president.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
He didn't believe that he was involved in a criminal act, and to tell you the truth, I didn't either.
You don't have to be a constitutional lawyer to know that the Constitution is very precise in defining what is an impeachable defense, an impeachable offense. A criminal offense on the part of the president is the requirement for impeachment. I do not expect to be impeached.
The president now tried to turn the tables on the impeachment committee. It was demanding yet more tapes, and Nixon knew he could not refuse the body with the authority to judge him. Instead, he gambled on releasing the transcripts, but first he carefully doctored them.
He was worn out, dead tired. I couldn't have done it. I don't know how he physically did it. He's the most remarkably disciplined individual I've ever known in terms of his mind's control over his faculties. And he did it all. To the best of my knowledge, he cleared every one of those volumes, and they stacked up in the Oval Office, as you know, several feet high.
I've been reluctant to release these tapes, not just because they will embarrass me and those with whom I have talked, which they will, and not just because they will become the subject of speculation and even ridicule, which they will. I have been reluctant because in these and in all the other conversations in this office, people have spoken their minds freely.
Senate Republican leader Hugh Scott told reporters today that he has read 800 of the 1,300 pages of edited presidential transcripts. He said the transcripts reveal, quote, a shabby, disgusting, immoral performance by all of the people involved.
It was a spectacular move. Nixon hoped to overwhelm his critics with sheer volume. But the public was appalled by the language and fascinated by the number of expletives deleted. For that, the president's defenders tried to blame his lawyer.
Fred Bizard, a lawyer, a good lawyer, but he was nevertheless a lay Baptist minister. And he was very much offended whenever Richard Nixon said hell. Very much offended. And so he excised that. And Richard Nixon said hell a lot, I guess, because there were lots of expletive deleteds in the tapes.
I fouled up in the area where I'm supposed to be a master, the area of just politics. I'm not proud of what I did. I was appalled by some of the statements that appeared, although I wish they hadn't said expletives deleted. I wish they'd put them in, because they weren't as bad as many people think they were, although they were horrible enough.
In the big cities, calls for Nixon's resignation mounted. In the past, the president could ignore demonstrators, confident that Middle America was still with him. But now the president's popularity plummeted, and he became even more dependent upon conservatives, particularly the Southern Democrats.
I'll stay here and try to learn how to use the yo-yo. You'll go up and be president, bro.
Governor George Wallace of Alabama was one of these Southern Democrats who had delivered Nixon votes in the past. The president was wooing Dixie because he needed its representatives on Capitol Hill.
The key element there was the so-called boll weevils of the South, the Southern Democratic group of about 30 congressmen in the House. And as long as he could hold them together along with the Republicans, he was probably safe from an impeachment vote.
In fact, the president's survival rested on just 7 members of the Judiciary Committee, 3 Southern Democrats and 4 moderate Republicans. They could swing it either way. But would a Republican congressman vote to impeach a Republican president?
I think we were all reluctant to pull that sword out of the scabbard.
Congressman Cohen was called to an early morning meeting by a Republican colleague who was assembling the potential rebels.
I walked into his office that morning, and I was quite surprised, frankly, to see Jim Mann and Walter Flowers, and those were the 2 Southern Democrats that we felt would have great difficulty in voting for articles of impeachment.
It really made me feel reassured that 4 Republican members, as well as the other 2 Southern Democrats, all of whom were having to express views that their constituency might not support, had come to the same conclusion that the evidence was such that it was necessary to bring charges.
I recall Walter Flowers stand up and say, let's shake this thing up and dump it out and see what things we can agree upon. What are all the allegations, and there were many, do we think that this group here could agree that an impeachable offense had been committed?
The surprising coalition offered its support to the mainstream Democrats, but it insisted on limiting the offenses to be included in the articles of impeachment.
We did not want to have a laundry list of charges that were undirected and uncoordinated, that we really wanted to reflect our deep concerns about the obstruction of justice, the abuse of power, and the continuing nature of the offenses, which had started before the Watergate and continued until the time that we were meeting.
News of the defection traveled fast.
They were perceived in the House to be somewhat conservative, supporters of the president, and for them uniformly to abandon the president carried far greater weight than their vote.
Nixon, frantic to get the 3 Southern Democrats back on his side, had his chief of staff place a call to Governor Wallace to ask for help.
And the president said, "George, are you still with me?" And the governor said, "No, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I am not." And the president hung up, looked at me and said, "Al, I've just lost the presidency."
On July 24, 1974, the House Judiciary Committee opened debate on the resolution to impeach the president.
Resolved that Richard M. Nixon, President of the United States, is impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and that the following articles of impeachment be exhibited to the Senate.
The coalition picked a front man to formally introduce their 3 articles of impeachment. But Nixon's defenders proved themselves more than ready for a fight.
For example, they charged the president with joining a conspiracy to obstruct justice. Well, I didn't know about any conspiracy, and so I asked him, when did the president enter into any agreement? Where was he? What were the words used at the time of it?
When and in what respect and how did the president declare that policy? And I wish the gentleman would be rather specific, since it is the heart of the allegation.
Well, of course, the means by which this policy has been done are the ones that are set out subsequent to the second paragraph.
Well, if the gentleman would confine himself to the question of when,
1 through
first,
9.
When was the policy declared?
The committee was embarrassed publicly by the ability of good lawyers like Chuck Wiggins and others to pound away at the broadness of the charges.
A simple parking ticket has to be specific. It has to say what you did that violated the law. It's got to have the license of your car. It's got to have the date that you did it. You want to replace that and say that doesn't have to apply to the president? Why, this is ridiculous.
Listening to Charlie Wiggins and Sandman say that we hadn't provided the specifics, I decided that it was time to recess the committee.
All of them realized they'd been hammered good, and that they didn't make a very good presentation for the record, and that unless something happened, you know, they were going to lose it.
I volunteered to take one of the articles and said that I was prepared to stay up all evening working to make sure that it was as well prepared as it could be for the next day.
After working all night, every member of the coalition had thoroughly mastered his brief. The president's defenders didn't know what hit them.
I would ask a question of Congressman Donahue, and he would yield to somebody who was briefed on that issue, and that person would come back with what he would say abundant evidence of the president's involvement.
Specifically, on March 13, 1973, the president was told that Mr. Strawn had lied to investigators. Specifically, the president, who bears the ultimate responsibility for the enforcement of our laws, did not report this to the Attorney General or to the director of the FBI.
And then when he finished, another member was recognized, and he began filling the record with all the specificity that anybody could ever want.
Specifically, on August 10, Porter testified falsely before the Watergate grand jury. Specifically, on September 12 and 13, Magruder met with Mitchell and Dean to plan a false story regarding certain meetings among Mitchell, Magruder, Dean, and Liddy in early 1972.
Specifically, the president did not tell Kleindienst that he had previously been given this information by Dean.
This detailed recitation of the president's misdeeds went on until television prime time. Then Chairman Peter Rodino called for a vote on the first article of impeachment charging the president with obstruction of justice.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Mr. Donahue. Aye. Mr. Brooks.
Aye.
The voice was hushed, whispered, and it wasn't pleasant on the part of the first one to vote aye.
Mr. Conyers. Aye.
You could tell from the sound of the voice that it was reluctant, but it had to be done.
Mr. Butler.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
And of course I knew what the votes were then, because I was tallying them up in my mind, and I knew that we had voted overwhelmingly to impeach. And when I cast my vote, my voice just about cracked, and I said aye.
Mr. Rodino.
Aye.
Nixon still had a fighting chance. Impeachment had to go to the House floor for debate and a vote, and then on to a trial in the Senate where a two-thirds vote was needed for conviction.
I conceded the issue that we were going to lose in the House, but I felt that the Senate had a glimmer of hope, and I hung that hope until the bitter end.
To be sure of a two-thirds majority, the Senate would need evidence even more overwhelming than the Judiciary Committee had laid out. It would need a smoking gun. But the White House wasn't giving anything away.
Is the White House going to honor those subpoenas issued this morning?
I didn't know that any had issued yet.
Yes, we've got them for April 4th and June 20th and June 23rd.
Yeah, well,
As usual, the subpoenas were for tapes. Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski demanded 64 more, and he resorted to tough tactics to get them. He could inflict terrible political damage on the president by naming him as a co-conspirator in open court. He asked for a meeting with Nixon's lawyer and his chief of staff.
What I did is I said to Haig and to St. Clair, now I will reduce my demands to 18, I believe I said, of these tape recordings. And I'll give you the exact ones I want, and forget about the others. And if you don't do that, I must then insist on the subpoena being served, and I must disclose the naming of Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator because it's important to my sustaining my position on the subpoena.
I said, that sounds like blackmail. And I recall he said something like, well, there's blackmail and there's blackmail.
How much time will you give us? And I said, well, I'll give you 2 or 3 days, whatever you need to make the decision. It was decided that I would be notified on Tuesday as to what the decision was. On Monday afternoon, I learned Mr. Nixon spent some 6 hours doing nothing but listening to the 18 tapes.
On one of them, he heard his own voice giving orders that provided conclusive proof of his guilt. This was a smoking gun. He instructed his lawyer to reject Jaworski's demand.
On Monday, not waiting until Tuesday, on Monday, St. Clair called me and said that the president would not agree to it. So, when I was advised, I said, well, meet me in court.
Within 2 months, Jaworski's demand for the tapes had reached the Supreme Court.
Well, it says equal justice under law, so we ought to win, Phil.
When the court met to hear the case of the United States of America versus Richard Nixon, Leon Jaworski spoke first.
This nation's constitutional form of government is in serious jeopardy. If the president is to say that the Constitution means what he says it does, and that there is no one, not even the Supreme Court, to tell him otherwise.
Nixon's lawyer, James St. Clair, warned the court against encroaching on the unique powers of the chief executive.
I say the president should decide as a political matter what should be made available, that the court has no right to determine what the executive will offer in evidence.
In a ruling that bears on the limits of presidential power, the Supreme Court said today that President Nixon must surrender more Watergate tapes. 64 tapes sought by the special prosecutor for the Watergate cover-up trial were ordered turned over to Judge Sirica to determine what evidence in them is relevant. The decision was unanimous, 8 justices in concurrence.
Now, surely, the fatal evidence was within Jaworski's grasp.
I think the president realized its finality and at the same time asked whether or not there was any opportunity to either survive it or to put a twist on it that would preserve his incumbency, of course.
The president had only a few days before the courts, the special prosecutor, and the Congress would hear the tape with the conclusive evidence. He tried to use this time to his advantage.
I got a call from Al Haig, who was President Nixon's chief of staff, asking if he could come over and meet with me.
I asked to see him alone. But when I got there, Bob Hartman, his pseudo-chief of staff at the time, was sitting there with him.
He came in, and obviously he was a little annoyed that there was somebody else there, and he started humming and hawing.
I held back a little, but I did tell the vice president he should prepare himself, that there was a new tape.
Al Haig left my office that morning of August 1st, went back to the White House, and then subsequently, right after lunch, he called and asked if he could have a private meeting with me.
Haig handed the vice president a list of the options that were open to Nixon.
He could resign, he could step aside under the 25th Amendment, one or two others, including the possibility of him resigning in return for me as president granting him a pardon.
Vice President asked me about the pardon authority of the president.
After that meeting, I met with Bob Hartman, and Bob was always a person who was skeptical and cynical.
I said you should have grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and the seat of the pants and kicked his ass out of this office. And then you should have held a press conference and told the world why you did it.
Late that night, I got a call from the vice president telling me that our discussion on those, quote, options was a non-discussion. There was to be nothing done, and that he was to have no position on it. Well, I'm not dumb. I knew what had happened. He had shared that information with Hartman.
The White House assessed both messages, the denial of any deal and the vice president's willingness at least to talk about a presidential pardon. Haig had other urgent business. The smoking gun tape was about to be released to the court, and he had to alert the Republicans who were still supporting Nixon.
Above all was the Wiggins of California, who had fought so vigorously and courageously for the president. And I told the president I felt it was imperative that we tell him what was in this tape so that he not commit political suicide.
The tape was recorded 6 days after the Watergate break-in. Nixon can be heard ordering his chief of staff, Haldeman, to use the CIA to halt the FBI investigation.
Essentially what it was that the President of the United States had consensually agreed to join a conspiracy, stating it in lawyer language, consensually agreed to join a conspiracy to hide relevant information from the FBI.
Nixon's staunchest defender called a press conference as soon as the transcript of the smoking gun tape was released.
With great reluctance and deep personal sorrow, I am prepared to conclude that the magnificent public career of Richard Nixon must be terminated involuntarily. And I shall support those portions of Article 1 of the Bill of Impeachment adopted by the Judiciary Committee, which are sustained by the evidence.
In the House of Representatives, there is not a member left who thinks the president will not be impeached, and apparently not many who will side with him when it comes to a vote. Before the president made his disclosure of new evidence yesterday, the biggest vote against him in the Judiciary Committee was 28 to 10. But by today, his 10 supporters had all changed their minds.
Crowds began gathering outside the White House, waiting for the end.
first he was ready to do it, and then he would meet with the family, and the family, understandably, would be very much opposed to his quitting. That's the term he used, quit. And so he delayed.
Vice President Ford met at lunch with senior Republicans at the Capitol Hill Club, and they agreed that Nixon had to be made to face facts.
Well, it was decided at the luncheon that a group of three, Senator Hugh Scott, the Republican leader in the Senate, Senator Goldwater, one of the most senior members, Congressman John Rhodes, the House Republican leader, went to the White House and had a summit meeting with President Nixon.
It's well known that the situation on the floor of the House has deteriorated to the extent that impeachment is really a foregone conclusion.
Senator Goldwater told Nixon that out of 100 senators, he had only 4 firm votes left. That same evening, August 7th, Nixon finally confirmed to his family that he was about to resign, and a White House photographer was told to record the moment. The president began to say goodbye to his inner circle.
He said, jail isn't the worst thing in the world. I mean, that's where you can get some peace of mind and a chance to do some good writing, after all. I mean, Gandhi and Lenin and others did a lot of their best writing in jail.
Having announced he would resign at noon on the 8th, Nixon made his farewell speech to his staff.
If the greatness comes and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes, because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
At least for part of the speech, he was looking directly at me. And of course, I could tell that he wasn't looking at me because there's that slightly glazed, half-glazed look of somebody whose mind is behind his eyes, which are simply there.
We want you to continue to serve.
His eyes are really turned inward on his thoughts.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
His words, you know, they had a very spontaneous quality to them. It was like the great insight of his whole presidency at the very last moment of his presidency.
1 month after his resignation, Richard Nixon was pardoned by President Ford for all the offenses against the United States he has committed or may have committed. The pardon protected Nixon from indictment, but it implied guilt. And the taint of guilt he carried with him for 20 more years until his death on April 22nd, 1994. The legacy of Nixon remains as controversial as he was in life. History will undoubtedly credit him with many foreign and domestic accomplishments. But Watergate burned into the American consciousness an awareness that the president could lie, cheat, break laws, use the weapons of government against its enemies, indeed subvert the very idea of constitutional government. No president since Nixon has been fully trusted, and none may be for a long time. And that is the tragic legacy of Watergate. I'm Daniel Short.